Hello everyone, today we introduce early modern warfare. Yeah, I mean those kind of topics that you choose randomly to discuss one evening out of the blue. Well, this naturally stands as an introduction for the videos we already made. I must say at this point, albeit not covering modern warfare as medieval or ancient one, we created a pretty hefty playlist, and that's the reason in fact I need to make a bit of clarity about this. Naturally, I cannot introduce early modern warfare simply like this. This is mostly, a summary of aspects that we came across and that we will hopefully expand on in the future. To just give a general hint, if you want, of what matters in this story, at least from our standpoint, from Schwerpunkt point of view, and how can we improve also over time, because I realize that there is a consistent amount of let's say modern warfare enthusiasts out there. There are people that, interestingly enough, tend to be concentrated towards a certain area of Europe. That is not surprising, because definitely at the time there was a big deal going on there, and that turned out to be sometimes literally the most competent people in military terms, considering all the topics we cover. This is quite fascinating. I mean, you understand that they're prepared. They make interesting comments. They criticize profitably. They correct me. Not always, but getting to the point, right? They make very specific points that are interesting to address, and they especially ask me more because on Schwerpunkt we don't do as much modern warfare as the previous ones, and it was not meant, in fact, to be so, because not just because I'm not a modernist, but just a medievalist, but because I do have, in fact, scruples in this sense to talk about just things that I can look at. And sometimes on Schwerpunkt I expanded just making this video my own understanding of the era that I've always found very fascinating. I mean, if I hadn't studied medieval history at university at that point, I would have studied modern history. I would have loved especially the 17th. I love the 17th century personally. 30 Years' War, Louis XIV, and beyond, because it's just very wide. What we'll see today is that the horizons of modern warfare starts being really global, right? We don't reach that level of globality in insight, but from a European perspective, but basically at the end of the 7 Years' War. So today we do not cover that. That's the second, let's say, late modern age, if you consider contemporary one, starting at the end of the century with the bourgeois revolutions and especially the nation state in France. But there is definitely more to say. For example, I never made a battle video about modern warfare. I studied something back in the day. I studied Battle of Gravelines, if you prefer. I did look at, the Battle of Pavia. I got interested in some aspects, especially of the Battle of Cerignola, Marignano. These ones are the punching ones at the beginning of the Italian wars. There is definitely a lot that we covered, as you know, on Schwerpunkt. A very important part was, fundamentally of the Ottoman Wars. By the end of it, we talked a lot about the Siege of Vienna in 1683. We discussed Montecuccoli. We made a series about Prince Eugene. So we began to say something here and there also with other videos, and that, if you go in the playlist, that many people do not know that there are playlists out there on this channel, but you can selectively look at all. And as we were saying before, there is enough videos at this point. We're starting to cover interesting aspects. But sometimes I covered a bit more general issues. Sometimes, morality of the time, certain technological aspects. We talk definitely and unavoidably about the I don't know, the traces italiennes, the general improvements in, the art of war that time, same from Clausewitz, brought us there, while discussing the progress in the theory of the art of war properly meant, starting from the modern age. So as we were saying before, we just now address some issues in a bit of an explanatory orientation. So first of all, it's obvious we should address the question of the so-called, albeit improperly called, because nobody actually believes it in anymore, military revolution, that you should cross out of the of the viable expressions to define this era that had nothing to do with revolutions. The only acceptable revolution in my historiographical vocabulary is when you speak of, I don't know, the American Revolution, French Revolution. I accept those because it became so so much into use that it's as if it took a name on a new meaning in itself, right? But revolution means actually something very different, etymologically speaking. And what Parker's thesis was about. Parker has been a great historian who wrote a lot, and we all thank him for his work. But definitely coming up with this idea of the military revolution wasn't particularly happy from a conceptual point of view, because it basically tricked people into believing that there was something of dramatic and irrepeatable in importance that happened in these centuries that changed everything. It was an extremely gradual and somewhat also non-innovative. I mean, something that had been set on those tracks from before change, and that also reached. There's not a reaching point, right? There is not a teleological transformation. There is not a deterministic transformation either. There is a bit of technologistic prejudice, as always, because if you come from the idea that this was all about firearms, right, and this is what defines the thing most. No, right, it was never about technology. These things happened, of course, they were catalyzed by technology, but technology was just a consequence, right, overwhelmingly a consequence and just minimally a cause. Doesn't matter how impacting on the field, on what you can measure materially, say, thinking at the individuality of a trooper, right? The cause of technology is way more important than its effects, right? And technology can exist in the first place just because there is an adequate environment when you can applicate it profitably, right? There are technological inventions that do not find an adequate field of application for even 100 years. They are maybe just so effective and so advanced that they don't fit in the doctrine of the time. This is to be observed easily, even in contemporary times. Think something like the mitrailleuse, that aside from some categorical definition, it was technically not an automatic machine gun, but practically it was. And it was so powerful at the time, the French basically couldn't find an adequate doctrine of application, even if they were so technologically advanced. Over the Germans in 1870, they lost it anyway. While the mitrailleuse definitely made its astonishingly, appreciated work during World War I. We're talking about a technology of more than 40 years before. And those were times in which technologies improved dramatically faster than during the modern age. If you want my opinion, like we had, that is, of course, what is the modern age? We should define its beginnings, and in that sense, define what what medieval warfare was in that sense. Today's timeline is something between 1480 to 1650, just by rough approximation. Some people make the Middle Ages finishing by 1453, with the end of the 100 Years' War, the fall of Constantinople, others with 1492, 1494, the discovery of the Americas, the beginning of the Italian Wars. Even just about the concept of Renaissance, there is a bit of a debate, right? You pick Italy begins, I don't know, even in the 14th century, or in the 15th. Some, you pick England, some historians make it begin at basically in the mid-16th century. I mean, these are purely conventional ideas that naturally they're very interesting because they are a historical product, right? They have not a scientific character. By themselves, they do not mean absolutely anything by the slightest. There was never anything modern. There was never anything medieval. It's just to say more or less what we're talking about without having to fix the date and time and space all the time, right? And has nothing to do with any. But I want to stress this, with any kind of substantial meaning, right? And of course, even less an idea like a revolution, because if you ask me, actually, and I say this for the sake of just perspective, to me, actually, medieval warfare, if we pick it from a political and social point of view, which at the end of the day we know is what makes the military one, finished by between 1792 and 1918, as far as I'm concerned, right? If we really fix those standards, that measurement, that you can appreciate it in that sense. And that is also, and the technologistic prejudice is exactly this. It's pretending to explain history by saying, oh no, but the Middle Ages, they had just swords and crossbows, and here there were guns and and cannons explode. This doesn't mean anything. I repeat it, by the slightest. What even the military organization of most powers throughout this phase in Europe, we covered most of Europe at this point, didn't differ substantially from medieval times throughout most of the early modern age, right? What starts really making the difference along that pattern is naturally the quantity of professional troopers, indeed, the money spent for them, all the state building, in a sense, was caused in part by this, but also was a cause in itself. But the real, to me, a proper modern army, as we intended, a stouter one with a permanent cadre and that specific nature of a country's army, it's with Louis XIV, right? This is extremely important. I mean, it's second half of 17th century France that makes the big difference there. Consider that, I don't know, by the mid 16th century, the French army was like, they could field armies of 20,000 men. By the beginning of the War of Spanish Succession, the French army was 500,000 soldiers. Just to give you a bit the scale of, and that was France, by the way, right? The others couldn't, at least if not through coalition warfare, that could brought similar numbers on the field, just simply because it was basically everybody against France. And today we don't have also the time to explain everything about the causes. Of course, we have already done it in part. We'll keep doing it in the other videos. But this is just to give a very broad picture of the world, to make some kind of point, some kind of point of reference, let's say. Many people say this is also the end of feudal Europe proper. As I was saying before, I don't think this is frankly true, right? There are interesting things going on, especially the early modern age. Most Europe was feudal in nature. Still, in the practice, it doesn't matter how more institutionalized or stable certain organisms were becoming. Fundamentally, they were feudal states in a way or another, right? There is definitely the development of an absolute monarchy, but absolute monarchy was the apex, if you want, of feudalism, because it was basically the idea that the king was taking over ever more prerogatives, of course, but it still was in that deeply, right, from a political institutional point of view, it was a contractual process, which may sound oxymoric, but it's really not, because absolutism was basically, say, taking on the burden of organizing an administration by freeing the various classes from mostly billeting the troops and getting something else in exchange. It was still based on that balance, that negotiation. What makes the difference far ahead, naturally, is the nation state that instead cuts the whole thing, says that the king is not the one that, paradox, it doesn't matter how powerful the king had de facto become, right, and come close to the same concept of nation state in a sense, but nation state cuts with completely with the idea that the king is there to basically protect the rights, the pre-existing rights of the subjects, and the state becomes the sole source of law, right? So that the rest has just to obey in a sense. And it's the same world we, where in another, of course, especially in civil law, the common law is very different, but in practice, right, also in the way we live, our states are the single most powerful thing we've ever seen historically compared to the private citizen, right? That is not a private citizen anymore in a sense. He's private just for some rights that he owns within that society, but he's a public citizen, we could say, because it doesn't matter what he believes his rights are. In the moment in which he's on that field, he has to obey the law. It doesn't matter what. This naturally is a bit more complicated, but let's say today we arrive to the beginning of that absolutism, in fact with France, and the thing developed far more during the 18th century. But just for saying how different things were before, an age that we deem to be modern in the sense of, it's like us. No, it wasn't like us. It was mostly like the Middle Ages at large. For not talking about realities, especially in Central Eastern Europe, that were fundamentally not different at all from previous times, even just in kind of lifestyle. There is now we can't digress on the institutional development of certain countries, of certain monarchies, but let's say, for example, the failure of the creation of a centralized state in some of the major Central Eastern European monarchies at some point was also the cause of its collapse. Think about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a freaking colossus during this period, but basically collapsed within itself simply because the Szlachta had not accepted the creation of a strong monarchy, right, as was happening in Western Europe. We have to say that alongside another medieval legacy is objectively realizing that the developments in Western Europe, looking at this axis that goes from, I would say, from Britain to Italy, from Spain to Germany, certain areas, especially of Germany, is properly the most advanced area. Is the richest, is the most statal-like, it's the one that produces more sources, larger armies. So in a sense, yes, this is practically what makes the difference, and it's not even a matter of numbers or something. It's properly a matter of control, of political control on the armed forces and their organization, that will make these countries rocket. Especially if you look at the Netherlands, especially from an economical point of view. Britain, as we've seen today's time, not much, because Britain literally takes off with the beginning of the 18th, at the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century. But it doesn't secure its status proper until the second half of the 18th, in the way we think of the British Empire in its might. Culturally, because if you pick still countries like Italy here, the Renaissance was basically early modern culture is Italian, in language, and pretty much everywhere. In terms also technology, military technology, advisors coming everywhere in Europe from that country. France as a model of state building instead, right? And in fact, also the most kind of sound the strongest are, but chiefly Spain. If we look at the proper professionalism, the modern professionalism of its armed forces. In the early modern age, when we look at the strongest army out there, we look at the Spanish one. At the Tercio, at the naturally at the broader decline of Spain, that even in there was something much less deterministic that is often. We almost never speak of Spain. I don't know why. Maybe we concentrate a bit more in Middle European history, but we'll have to make very thorough discussions about Spain, because even just studying it from a financial point of view and looking at what was happening in Europe, in America at the time, is of excruciating importance. Basically, you go nowhere if you don't study the history of the Spanish Empire during the early modern age. And it's not a surprise that the Spanish, in fact, were the ones that properly came up with, let's say, the idea of a what we have an idea of a modern army from, let's say, in a non-medieval sense. We said before that, to me at least, a true modern, but let's say, towards a second modern age, let's say, is France. But of course, those who make the difference at the beginning of this period, with the Battle of Cerignola during the Italian Wars, is Spain. Right, it's Spain, with combined tactics of Pike&Shot are fully integrated, also with, many stress on the fact, it was so complete because they had the assault infantry of the Rodeletters and so on. The greater point is the fact that it could now finally and effectively stop everything with Pike&Shot, right? The Swiss, in that sense, had opened the path since the mid-15th century, but they had basically been halted by the development of artillery, as Marignano and the horrendous gaps that artillery created in their ranks signified. So the Swiss declined relatively slowly, yes, but of course it was the Spanish model that took over. It was eventually imitated by all the other countries, because it wasn't just about having that, thousands of pikemen square formation. It was about integrating that with firearms. And as we know, what whole Pike&Shot deal is throughout all this period is this eternal solution search for the best ratio of pikes and shots, that naturally has a lot to do also with technological development, but not only. In fact, if we wanted to make a healthy technological timeline between these events, we could say that we can't speak of the early modern age in terms of, the age of these two inventions. The granulation of power, that was an Ottoman thing, because they were mastering that at the time, and maintaining some of the most advanced firearms technology throughout all the period, and not declining at all. We actually explained this. We made also a lot of videos about Ottoman warfare. There's a playlist even in there. The myth that the Westerners surpassed the Ottomans in technological terms is wrong, right? It's at best just a simplistic explanation, and especially it's not evidenced by the sources and by the same Westerners, right? Because when Montecuccoli seized the Ottoman camp after the Battle of St. Gotthard, he said that, as Marshal of the Empire, that the Ottoman powder was of the finest quality, right? That is what actually made the difference. I think we know that there was no freaking decline at all, and the Ottoman Empire was shrinking for other reasons. There are, of course, having basically 3 or 4 fronts continuously open, and how they even held for such a long time is the real question we should answer there. The other technology being bayonet, that of course is not properly firearmed, but is still, it's fundamentally integrated in firearms, and that opens to essentially linear tactics. That is something that mostly occupies the 18th and up to the late 19th century as the standard tactics out there. That is only shot, right? At least for as far as infantry is concerned. Because the other point there is properly cavalry, right? And the fact that also in here, interestingly, there is some bit of a stereotype of the idea that cavalry during this time was knocked out. As you know, if you have listened to me from other videos, I'm definitely a cavalry fan. If you also knew what's my name, but especially I can't stand these modernistic and technologistic prejudices for which the idea that at this time feudal warfare was over, was destroyed. No, it was always there, and cavalry was always there. Like even in the hardest moment for it, that definitely made it shrank considerably in overall in relative force on the field compared to the other arms, and even in number at some point still was there, and still kept doing the same thing the cavalry always does, that is charging, scattering the enemy, pursuing, and that was never over. And here we're not talking about things like the Polish winged hussars that obviously are this successful anachronism that lives on to the, up to all this period, effectively achieving remarkable results against, let's call it Western Pike&Shot, but I'm talking specifically about Western battlefields. Cavalry was always important, and it always performed those functions, even when when they were obliged to caracol, that is, as you know, basically a skirmishing, quite orderly, but also substantially a skirmishing form of, a skirmishing tactic. At the end of the day, the Reiter would throw their pistols against, the enemy and charge, because the idea was softening up at the point of at least trying at the end to charge and to break, right? And even at that point, there were lancers. There were proper, there was cavalry that was specifically designed, of course, to charge, right? Not just to skirmish. And it's always been out there. And the idea that cavalry just, somewhat contracted at the point of barely disappearing is wrong, right? And there's tons of examples like that. Not just because, of course, in spite of the intensification of pitched battles and the importance of this infantry squares and so on, Pike&Shot in general, it's not all what warfare was about. So cavalry would be always needed in many situations, basically most situations, as of primary importance. But simply because, even in fact, in open field, it was always there. Naturally, there were countries that relied more or less on it, but at the same time, this is also a great time of homogenization of European warfare. That is something like, if you look at fundamentally Western Central Europe since the 14th century, there is no difference anymore, right? There can be something, ethnic, something of, a bit more exotic here and there, but the substance of whatever existed between Portugal to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, it was the same, right? There are interesting changes. For example, Poland, that we just mentioned before, we made a video about, was much more Western in character at the beginning of this period than it was at the end, because not just the concrete, the final union with Lithuania would shift, its horizons east, but properly because because also of that reason, they invested in other forms and other tactics and other assets that were needed to cope, even just strategically, on this much broader, territory with enemies like, the Tartars, etc. Let's not even talk about what all the Ottomans could field at their northern borders in Central Europe, all the ethnic traditions that remained in the Balkans, but all these peoples that fundamentally were keeping to fight in more or less, westernized fashion, but still with a lot of medieval relics of their own traditional warfare. For the Ottomans, by the way, most of the time, others, of course, also against, but still, they were fundamentally Christian Europeans integrating their armies in the Ottoman one normally. So here it's the picture we will see a bit there. It is very, very varied. And here we don't even talk much about what was happening around the world, because this is basically the age of exploration. So today we don't expand in the enormous chapter what the Europeans were doing in Asia, in America, and so on. But that's also very important, of course, for what was happening in Europe itself, and through which you can't even explain certain developments, right? Europeans start to grow, of course, because of what they had before, but also are able to draw ever more resources from the rest of the world that are invested often in armies that fight in Europe, right? And there are some massive strategical changes. The political balance of Europe also brings certain areas to become the battlefields, in a sense. From the beginning to the end of the Italian wars, battlefields shift from Italy to Flanders, for example. The Balkans, the Danubian area were also a very important theater. The Baltic, especially at sea, though, but not only. right, has this great development. We don't talk about naval warfare either, because that is something, first of all, I'm not an expert in. We discussed it here and there, but it's also a wholly different thing. This time, navies become ever more important, naval technology is ever more properly, there is the distinction. The Swedes, that were by no mean a dramatic power at the beginning of this period, but they're at that moment the ones that start designing specifically warships, ships for war, and not just this hybrid with mercantile that had existed up to that point. We speak of the age of sail, albeit, if you look at the Mediterranean, but even in the Baltic, think about a bit later, like at the beginning of the 18th century, Peter the Great of Russia did. Using galleys to defeat the Swedes that used vessels of the line in the Baltic because of the coastline of the sea bottom that was there was not so much dip, etc. So there is a lot going on there. Most of the stuff, by the way, the Mediterranean is much more traditional, but also in a functional sense, right? We made recently a video about Venetian naval developments during the 17th century. We'll have to discuss quite seriously that theater again at some point, because it's a bit forgotten, but by no means very important, right? What I was saying, too many things actually, because it's so complicated and intertwined here that it all this is important from a methodological point of view, historically speaking, that the early modern age is not a dramatically documented moment, right? Especially for things we would like to know in terms of technicalities of war, right? Most of the situation is not so much different from the late Middle Ages. We know relatively few about those things that since the ancient world, like what did NCOs did, for example, in the field. We don't know much, right? Even the progression of development of Pike-and-Shot tactics between the usual ladder, Maurice of Nassau, Gustavus Adolphus, and so on. They are surely useful, but they're not so categorical. Other countries were basically doing the same, like this idea of the order of march, counter march, the orderly pattern in certain. I don't know, if you look at what the Dutch were doing at the time of Maurice of Nassau, surely was something about that, even if it's not wholly clear how much the theoretical, but because there is a lot of treatises starting to happen, but what is written in the treatises is not necessarily what happened on the field, that we know was on a regular basis much more disorderly. But if you study, what the same Spanish were doing at the same time, basically doing the same thing. That's why it's we don't have to be tricked by the categorical nature of such changes over time, because there was a lot of back and forth. It was a non-linear process of development, of transition from the pike to the shot, and the transformation of the ratio in the meanwhile. We talked, I think, extensively about also the English Civil War. That is an interesting chapter because of many reasons, not just because of English history that is beautiful in my opinion at that time, but also because there were some interesting, albeit characters to it. I don't know, a prevalence of the shot maybe earlier than in other countries, but not for specific structural reasons, just because of the political and strategical needs of that specific war. Surely, the Swedish campaigns in Poland, those are fascinating throughout all the, but it's very complicated. We can't cover them all. We will hopefully, surely not here, but we will hopefully discuss them at some point on the channel. So because of this lack of documentation, I think the best thing is to reason in more concrete, overall, and pragmatic terms, right? And always realizing that the improvements in this time were not much a matter of this or that technology appearing, but rather an incredible effort from a political and social point of view to organize ever larger armies, to maintain them ever longer on the field, right? And this went in parallel also with a dramatic development of siege warfare, fortifications, military engineering, that actually brought towards the end of this period to the apex in a sense of positional warfare. We made a video about this also recently, and in the 18th century things would gradually change, but also there was a dramatic improvement. So there was also a sensible understanding from the side of commanders that could be also dramatic military theorists, such as Raimondo Montecuccoli, as we've seen, that is this very important bridge in the theory of the art of war between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz that was unparalleled in that sense. It was rare at the time, right? But the need for an ever more scientific approach to, especially stemming from siege warfare, so the art of fortification in a sense, but that had to reflect also what was happening in open field, was felt as a necessity, right? Just, passing from this kind of notionistic, empirical approach to a more theoretical, scientifically based one, right? And we stop at the end of this period with the scientific revolution, which is actually a term that even in there maybe should be not sensationalized, but when you look at figures like Galileo or Newton, you realize something was happening at so many levels of society in terms just of the implementation of technological development, innovation, investments, possibility of application of these devices that would change the world, in fact, especially and more evidently in the 18th century. So it's difficult to, here we see naturally a beginning that seems very impacting, like the close of the Renaissance era in Italy, once more through war, right? But its effects spreading throughout all the West, the birth of science, in modern science, let's say better, the spread of printing that we discussed recently. But that all brought together, these are changes, the change of the transition, the substitution of chemical power for muscle power in warfare. Yes, firearms achieved that in a sense, but it wasn't quite just that, just as the term Pike&Shot tells you. There are bitter conflicts at this point rising in the same Europe that in a sense boosts itself, structures itself in ways that change dramatically, even just from a cultural point of view. Think about the 30 Years' War, but before that, the wars, that had all sparked from the Reformation, the war in France, and the same threat of the Turk, right? The peak and decline of Ottoman conquest. The conquests of the Spanish Empire and the Dutch Revolt, the 80 Years' War, right? The defeat of the Spanish Armada, for example, and the revolutionary victory of Parliament in the English Civil War. These are all chapters that we will discuss separately, but you understand the non-deterministic, and non-banal set of events that occurred there. Things could have easily gone in different ways, and there's nothing that that would have changed dramatically, even the same ways of war. Have you ever thought? If you reason just through its technology, you would say, but have you ever thought, well, what these political events could bring? Like even just in the different types of warfare, like developing not dramatically different, but still substantially different types of war in general, and how they were fought. And we would be a different world, of course, without this thing. So we get the impression the early modern age was a moment in which the warfare changed the face of the world. I'm not a fan of this idea, because I believe that warfare has always changed the face of the world, together with politics and society, and they're blended all together. And I don't think that warfare here, doesn't matter how more intense it became, like it had never been seen in the world, is just the consequence of a broader development, right? Surely the pattern of war in a sense, was becoming more identifiable, more scientific, right? Even we can study it more easily, in a sense. But don't think that what was happening there was substantially different from, I don't know, the late Middle Ages, and that certain things didn't begin before that time. Because just think about how many centuries took firearms to make a concrete difference on the fields. It's just by the 16th century, for example, that artillery starts making the difference on a battlefield, kind of becoming a must. But at the same time, it wasn't also the decisive weapon. There is a tremendous subtle force, naturally, to field these new means, right? That is incomparable with previous logistical needs. So even armies that were maybe not so dramatically larger in size, but they were much heavier, let's say, than before, and still, yes, they also increased in size. But as we were saying before, the development of siege warfare, paradoxically, instead then, you would think the larger the armies, the easier. Like in the Middle Ages, monarchic, national monarchies develop, so smaller armies become larger because there's more political unity, and castles, the smaller ones that dotted Europe every few miles, would become individually useless. They would need larger ones, right? The same thing happens, and that blocks in turn warfare in a sense. But in modern warfare, that's much more accentuated in a sense, because in medieval times still armies were capable of projecting themselves on a regular basis in a strategical context much more far away. Not because they were more powerful, but because there were less limits in between. In modern times, these boundaries, these impediments increase dramatically with the science of fortification and so on. It is right to observe, of course others have observed too, that until the French Revolution, if you want, this way of war would remain somewhat similar throughout all the period. We have seen it also in von Clausewitz, what the French Revolutionary armies and Napoleonic Wars changed in sheer scale of troops, of forms of supplies and so on. So and changing even not in a counterintuitive way, right? Napoleonic times, as we've seen in von Clausewitz, armies lived mostly off the land. In modern times, this enormous logistical trains were needed, which is paradoxical because the armies were smaller, but there is a reason for that. We studied in von Clausewitz. That has to do with the state building, definitely, and forms of political participation and so on. And that slowed down armies. This is what we see here, that there is both from a strategical and a tactical point of view, actually, the weight, right, the military theory here that we can't read in modern times, that's the greatest concern. The fact that these armies were unwieldy because they were so heavy for the first time, they created enormous problems and reduced even the mobility, the flexibility. But this doesn't mean that there was an evident symmetry there, especially in Western Europe, that still boosted other improvements there. I've seen in firearms, for example, that were a solution to that, because in war, the motivations are the ones they are, and they are ever stronger in a sense, the larger the polities are. So what happens on the field is a consequence of that, and there are ever more punching ways of fighting in that sense. Firearm technology in there, if you measure it just by sheer amount of energy contained in a bullet compared to the one that was on a sword by muscle power, is something overwhelming. Like, it's by scale something you can't even think to compare with. Of course, for a while, armor, for example, remained, right? It's not until the regularization, let's say the massive scale introduction of flintlock musket by the mid-17th century, that was deemed completely useless to wear armor, because at least, in the range 100 meters, you could basically kill. Even if not with such a high degree of precision, that in warfare is also way by scale dramatically lower than any performance in training can be. Kill, however, an armored opponent. So obviously at that point the sheer an effective armor would have become impracticable, just I presume in terms of movements, but just also in terms of costs. And the reason why already by the mid 17th century armor had dramatically shrank most troops basically were starting not to wear it proper, because of course mobility was more important. But not just that, but it was just about the fact that costed, and the same cost of that could be invested more profitably in firearms. And if you fix naturally on the individual security, you get nowhere, because the point of saving more people's lives is saving the army's life, and therefore to create a system that of course doesn't give a damn functioning in terms of the individual, right? But I say this because there is always the genius sometimes that comes up to saying, why did it abandon armor where firearms were becoming so more important in the field? Well, that's self-explanatory, I think. So that brought naturally also to the dynamization of tactics eventually. These things were, it is evident already since the first half of the 17th century, right? There is the very important connection also with the return of some ethnic, Central Eastern European cavalries. As we were saying before, think about the Polish winged hussars that occasionally would be able to charge even, Western pikemen successfully, because they had even longer spears and lances than them. They had the proper training and equipment that a nobiliar cavalry was still retaining in a country like Poland compared to other countries in Europe. So it's not really technological, right? But it's evident that from there the Swedes that suffer from that, Gustavus Adolphus starts saying, what, we should also try that, to be more flexible, to have more cavalry to counter that, to become more dynamic on the field. And that is tested in the 30 Years' War, where definitely the importance of cavalry is measurably increasing. But that was already evident since probably the same end of the 16th century, right? As we were saying before, there is no real end of cavalry, and probably the increase of it, like the turning point from the decline to the revival, is probably earlier than we think. Then, of course, in terms of absolute value, that took a while to recover full steam, but let's say it was always important. But I don't know. They invented. They even invented metal shield. They increased strength of the Maximilian armors that by the early 16th century were meant to literally resist arquebus fire. But they were so costly that just the very elite could wear it. The majority of pikemen would have much lighter equipment, of course, and when pretty much not even metal one sometimes, very frequently. They invented even heavier shields, metal that could stop bullets. Yeah, there are these things. There are these, especially during the second half of the 16th century, even still in the beginning of the 17th, you find in armories this kind of stuff. But practice was also heading to. But let's say that shows you how non-linear the development was. How there were also different ideas, theories. Then practices were always way more practical, in fact. But it is true in general that the feudal age meant as, the armored cavalrymen, as they had been most, especially during the late Middle Ages, functionalized in scale, in consistent numbers to have that punching for it's decline, right? Cavalry is still punching, but it's way less armored, and it will head toward that direction. So the forms of military organization also are important to realize, because as we were saying, the feudal element remained, right? Actually, it was the same aristocrats that participated to the subcontracting of military companies, right? But still relying part with the feudal levy, right, with some mixture of payment, right? But the most common was the pure mercenary force that in a sense dominates the period. These were people coming literally from everywhere, right? There is no thing like a national belonging properly meant. Yes, there are, I don't know, the Tercio, for example, was very felt deeply as a kind of a, also in a national sense, but I mean the Tercio was also multinational, right? There were Germans, there were Italians, not just the Spanish. But they were all people, we've seen they were often the scum of society, like, but even up to the 18th century. 18th century, let's say, national armies, they were just basically about the scum of Europe, recruited for everything. Where do you think that, I don't know, the Prussian army of Frederick the Great were just, people born and raised in Pomerania? Of course, there was plenty of Polish, of Italians, of French, all there, too. This is a normal feature. All here, the problem is not manpower, right? It's the money you have to pay them for, because you always find somebody who is willing to get paid to even to get killed at some point, because life sucked so badly at the time that after all, that was not much of a worse career than another one. We made videos like that. But the important thing here is naturally the growing efficiency in administrative and also economical fields, logistical fields, that gave a rise in the military field, too, of armies that, say, since Roman times had never quite been seen, at least in terms of organization, regular drill, discipline, which is something, is not to say that medieval warfare had actually been less effective, right? So don't think that even these are generally the most important things, yes, but still you have to see what kind of society produces them. And of course, Roman times had been surpassed, militarily speaking, during the Middle Ages proper. But surely, aside from the cultural obsession of the Renaissance, that is the inspiration to classical models, ancient treatises of the Greeks, of the Romans, of course we are seeing in the early modern age the achievements of a medieval civilization that has far surpassed the ancient world and is now developing on itself with some concrete beginning of a scientific approach to war probe, right? That is somewhat empirical, yes, at the beginning, but nevertheless is now fixed more or less toward that direction. So obviously, change was never instant, was never total, and there are interesting exceptions, right? The armored knight, as we've seen, is present up to the very end of the 17th century on the battlefield, right? Some troopers, NCOs, etc. would, but even think about the cuirassiers. Let's say they had just mostly armored bust, but during the 18th century, right? And, I mean, hell, even at the beginning of World War I, there were cuirassiers fighting like that. But yes, I mean, the typical armored knight is something we see, however, still in full armor, in a sense, toward the end of the 17th century. But just for an elite, as you understand it, with less capacity of protection, of course, than before, given that firearms had become ever more effective. There was even properly a chivalric ethics still living throughout this period. Think about men such as Bayard, the Chevalier sans peur et sans reproche, whose death, delivered by the unchivalrous arquebus, as was thought of the time, as you know, took on this symbolical meaning of the end of an era, the death of chivalry, of knighthood in a sense, because just a stinky peasant, no one could shoot you like that, shoot like that, one of the greatest, highest nobility of Europe, that was powerful at the time, because they believed deeply in these things, right? They you have to think that medieval mindset, aristocratic mindset, was something almost proto-racial in terms of contempt towards the inferior classes. I mean, they believed they were somewhat superior beings, right, by selection. That the peasantry was somewhat kind of barely human beings, right? Of course, they didn't give a shit in absolute terms about any kind of national belonging. They cared about their military, their nobiliar character, of course, of their own country, but just because they were noblemen, right? They had no feeling towards the lower classes that we can parallel to a sense of modern, patriotism. That is, in fact, a late modern invention, something that here at this point was much more brutal than you can imagine. Like, if you look at what the Polish Szlachta treated the Polish peasantry like, not much different from animals, right? And there was an actual contempt and gratuitous violence and abuse in that sense. But this was normal pretty much everywhere. But obviously in those countries like that, where even the absence of a centralized state that could also put an end and kind of develop things more functionally, made a difference. Like the France of Louis XIV is in popular culture the apex of Versailles, the noblemen that don't give a shit about the peasantry, that give them the brioche and so on. Yeah, but Louis XIV created properly a national arm where there was also kind of a meritocracy, where the people had some more important than they had before. I mean, it's not a surprise that in insight that the French Revolution happened in France at the end of the day, because it's absolutism, it's these more advanced forms that contributed to the development of the middle classes as well in the long run, right? So never think that it's, most of the improvements in human history have been, the overwhelming improvements in human history have always been carried out by the elite, or at least those who, however, had the wide majority of wealth, of moral and material resources proper. That's also why the bourgeois revolutions, because at that point those guys had become so rich they could achieve what they wanted. So much big England, right? The whole freaking civil war was because the merchant didn't want to pay the ship money. Look, at the end of the day, they win. The parliament takes over. What do? They start investing an enormous amount more of that ever what this little ship money was at the beginning. In army, in war, and that is exactly what the monarchy was trying to do back in the day. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's always about power. Civilization, rights, improvements, etc. passes through that, right? It's a violent process, but there is an objective improvement, and that's what we talk about the British Empire in the first place. I'm not going to discuss colonialism now because it's out of our scope, but even in there, yes, that was a freaking brutal thing, right? It's not to say that other countries didn't do. The Europeans just were the ones who succeeded where the others failed, but it's, that in their smaller scale, those peoples were better. Like, just an excruciating story of, any tribal society is exclusively based on extermination, rape, and slavery. So every kind of rhetoric, the terrible Westerners, they came and they slaughtered, they raped and enslaved. Yes, and let me check what were doing those guys before. Turns out, it's not, well, but, the others maybe brought something more advanced where, there was a more orderly capacity of improvement, and at least that is what happened, even if you look at the end of colonialism itself. And that doesn't excuse, of course, the gratuitous democide, we could say, that, of course, Western colonialism brought around the world, and the ferocious oppression that, of course, happened, like in those times overall. But just saying that the rest of the world was no better at all, and whoever thinks this has very serious schooling problems. So, coming back on the idea of chivalry, surely knightly tradition was pretty much there at the center. Even pick Gonzalo de Cordoba. Now, I presume some of you do not even know who he was. I mean, he was he's with no absolute doubt of any sort, the greatest commander in modern history. Right? He invented modern warfare, just to be precise. El Gran Capitán, as it was called in Spanish. Well, he was the first properly great general of the gunpowder era, to make an approximation. Well, he was also, of course, a knight. He was a commander of the military order of San Diego and fought in the last crusade, at least of the Reconquista, against the Moors in Granada. Even if you look at another quite important guy, such as Gaston de Foix, well, there is this paradox that is only apparent in my opinion, because war always makes sense, more than any other human activity in kind of rational, logical sense, in spite of what people like to be fooled themselves not believing. He led this almost scientific campaign in Italy, culminating in the victory of Ravenna. It was a bloodbath, right? But he basically died himself in this, if you want, romantic, grandiose, chivalric feat of arms, this charge where he, these guys were able to throw themselves. Like, the French were absolutely nuts about this. Like, even if you look at, the siege of Candia, when the French reinforcements arrived, the Venetians said, don't go in the open, we'll be butchered. They didn't give a damn. They were so flamboyant, all this skirt, the typical, musketeer kind of sense of bravado. They went out there, they were killed to the last by the Ottomans, but hell, they died as they had ideally always wished to die. And that embodies definitely a knightly, if you want, a medieval or even older sense of themselves that today, because we, as modernistic, that is, stupid people, we decided that that everything has to be reconnected to our poor, simplified, positivistic understanding. We say, what a bunch of idiots. Those faders were definitely such, but at the same time, they came from a world that habitually employed them functionally on a regular base, and they were the sap of this world, right? If Europe made it at that point as it did, it was because these people believed in that. It wasn't just the French who reasoned like that. Any nobleman would do that. If you look at the greatest commanders throughout all this time, they could risk their life individually. I mean, look at, Gustavus Adolphus. Look at it. But even there was this sense, especially developed in the imperial side, because of actually Spanish influence that spread a bit from Spain into Italy, into Austria, this country. Pick Raimondo Montecuccolo. He was a nobleman, but the idea was that the noblemen, like the Spanish hidalgos, would actually take pride to fight on foot, to start their career rising through the ranks as normal pikemen. And this is what these guys actually would do. Not because just boosting morale, developing the sense of esprit de corps, looking at, being looked upon by the troop, but literally because that made them acquire experience. Of course, they had slightly easier, but for our standards, it wasn't easy at all. These guys risked their life, bled. They were atrocious experiences. This happened mostly in the imperial Catholic side because Spain was the dominant. Of course, Habsburg, the Habsburg connection, and Spain was the dominant military model, as we've seen. And at the end of the Reconquista, the Spanish had, if I'm not wrong, like one third of the Spanish adult males were hidalgos proper, that is, were noblemen. That, of course, it was like a gentry, but Spain had functionalized in that military war style since centuries and centuries against the Muslims of Spain. And therefore, there was this idea that, of course, such a huge amount of people couldn't be all knights, right? So they would regularly fight on foot, even if they were considered noblemen, right? and that brought in the tertio to derive this pride of sense that even noblemen fought in it, right? It was said that in the tertio there was not even a punishment against desertion, because the honor of belonging was so great that there was no need. Like, if you wanted to leave, nobody cared. It was just the prestige of getting there, and that everybody wanted that the real one. And consider it, even in this, that this is not a kind of a weird stuff. I mean, considering a freeman and nobleman is actually a medieval concept. It was still alive from the time of the, you could say even the Roman Empire, the Germanic tribes, pick the Italian communal armies. Theoretically, even the last commoner was considered a nobleman because he was a freeman. Like, it was like in the Germanic Heerban, right? Every freeman has that kind of sense of nobility because he's a freeman, because he won that in arms, in theory. And there is a bit even of maybe of classical imitation there with Hidalgos in the Tertio. I don't know, honestly. But surely it made sense. And it is true, of course, that social differences were being leveled in part by that. But nevertheless, this was the early modern age is the apex of the Ancien Regime in many ways. There is also a variety of enemies that the Europeans fight against, right? Even within the same Europe, not just as outsiders or partially ones like the Ottoman, but even for the same European traditions that have remained, as we were saying before, a bit unburied. I mean, if we pick America, I mean, the Aztecs and Incas were kind of Stone Age armies. So that explains also the astonishing success of the Spanish conquistadores, but it's not even here a technological problem. The conquistadores won largely because of their political intelligence and the fragmentation of enemy forces. That altogether doesn't matter where they were Stone Age. They could have easily overwhelmed them. Well, yes, I mean, steel and gunpowder did help, but nevertheless, they weren't decisive, not even by the slightest. Without mentioning that there is a lot of actually Native American history is shows this dramatic capacity, even of adaptation for the local political and social standards to certain tactics. I mean, there were certain tribes that the Spanish described as fighting with an order as pikemen that wouldn't be dissimilar from the one of the Germans. They were fighting like the Landsknechten. Well, those were imperials, but I mean, they were emulated by all the other. That's how they were fighting, even Protestant forces. Like the development of cavalry, of course, with the horse brought in the Americas. And if you look at the Americans of the Great Prairies, that they changed completely their own society. If you look at the Apaches, this we have to study them. They became ever more ravaging and aggressive and powerful through that. We're talking about societies that changed completely from sedentary to nomadic, sometimes thanks to the use of horse and functionalizing in an imperialistic predatory. Of course, exterminating widely all the other Native Americans around, right? Just for the thing we were saying before. Maybe we'll have to talk about that at some point, because that's very, very, very beautiful. So never underestimate human intelligence, right? Intelligence has nothing to do with race or wherever you come from. No, that we all have it, and adequate pressure makes us develop equally. But even looking at Europe, I mean, pick Ireland, the Celtic Fringe. I mean, there were warriors there during the modern age that, I mean, I can't say they would have not surprised Julius Caesar in the way they fought, but almost. I mean, surely Edward the First, right? Authentic medieval warriors still fighting, maybe knowing perfectly how to use a musket, indeed, but preferably fighting as in their traditional style. Why? Because they were dumb? No, because they were clever, and because that in that situation they would know how to exploit that more functionally than adopting other things, right? Naturally, even there things changed a bit, and the internationalization helps I mean, think about the Battle of Bamburgh, basically the only Irish victory this mentioned. Was not much even against the English, but against the Protestant Scots. Well, the guys were equipped with papal muskets sent from Rome, and the there is also this, as we were saying, broader absorption of the dominant model, right? Think about the Battle of Culloden Moor. It was just, yes, a very romantic thing, probably a very inconsidered strategical choice, but I mean, that army had still achieved something before. They threw them away with charge in front of English musketry, but I mean, it still worked. So never think again that even cold steel here is not something that works, because it did, right? And knowing how to fight with a sword would be, especially for every commander, kind of a duty almost. But if we look east, probably there are the most interesting things. From Poland to India, we could say still the mailed horsemen with lance and bow were a thing. These things would remain. I mean, look even at time of World War I in Caucasus, that would be guys fighting with mail armor. I mean, they were still functional. They knew how to use rifles and so on, but it was still use armor. I mean, even Native Americans sometimes in the 18th century used to find ancient Spanish colonial armor, out there. Mauryans, even in the Far East, in the Philippines, and so on. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, you could find something like that. I'm not kidding. So that's how far also European horizons start to expand. And consider that up to the 18th century, European dominance in the globe is not evident at all, right? It still has to happen. Basically, up to at least the end of the of the 7 Years' War. So we are in 1763. The greatest, with the rise of the English, I mean, the greatest power in the world is, no doubt, by sheer amount of power delivered, is China, is the Chinese Empire. There's no doubt about that of sort, and there's not even competition there. If you look at armies that were mobilized, forces, range, campaign theaters, enemies cope with, that was by far the strongest military in the world. No doubt. So we're looking naturally at traditions that seem to stem from the Middle Ages. Look at the Tartars, descendants of the Mongol hordes. Cretan mercenaries were the same ones used in the armies of Alexander the Great, were still employed by the Venetians 2,000 years later. Of course, with a bit of a different, maybe equipment, but don't think excessively much in the practice of war. The eastern sector, let's say broadly meant, would deserve a much greater attention. That's also why we covered so much of the Ottoman army in the past, and we'll keep doing it, because there you find these great influences. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to know there was surely the Ottomans asked, for example, to the Mughals some reinforcement against, even the Imperials in Europe. I'm not aware specifically of Indians fighting in the Ottoman army on the Danubian frontier, but that's how far the range would come. And an empire that stretched from the Ukraine to Sudan, and from Hungary to Arabia. You can imagine all the kind of melange of military traditions, of knowledge, practice. This idea of universalism is what, in fact, we lose in Europe at that time. But because things become more scientific and more universal proper, maybe in that sense, but before, to make things work, you also had to use the best from everywhere, and that's also what all great empires or great civilizations did, and was a proof of their advancement, not a passive, parasitory approach to these societies. They were always co-opted at the end of the day, because there was no way to control them anyway. So it's a dramatic change, and during the 17th century this accelerates, as you understand. We see over most Western Europe uniformed standing armies receiving flintlock and bayonet. On this, you should reflect on the fact that the French army, that was by far the strongest in Europe, reaching a level almost of hegemony. So the strongest, most advanced in organization, everything, also was the least advanced technologically speaking. That were the last to adopt certain these, properly the bayonet, if I'm not wrong. And that tells you how technology really is not the most important factor, but by far, I mean. Because the effectiveness is in the collective training, in the organization, in the supply. This is what really makes the difference. Armor vanished practically, inconsistent numbers. The pattern of warfare from there on remained embedded for in broader outline for 150 years. Right. Surely in the East, there were important persistences, right? But at a certain time, the models of Western Europe were imitated everywhere. I mean, if you wonder how the Russians conquered Siberia, they simply did with Pike&Shot, right? That was such a puzzling tactical problem for the Tatars, the horse archery, one of the Turks and so on. That they simply swallowed all Siberia like that, like one at the time of even the Great Day. I mean, like 1/3 of Tsarist income came from Siberian force. Siberia would remain basically a state on, a semi-autonomous state out there, lost in times, but a lot of warlords still having their. That's an interesting story as well, and of course, horse archery would maintain its own importance. But definitely, I mean, look at armored forces; these were all along Western patterns. I mean, even if in the most reactionary Russia, where you had still the streltsy equipped with, but there were still muskets and Bertisks, I don't know how to say it in English, but it was still technically Pike&Shot, right? Then it took eventually Peter the Great to create an army like the late 17th, beginning 18th century Western armies were like, but in there, the thing had taken over, right? This core of, you can trace a sort of, since Carolingian times, kind of a broader uniformation coming from Western Europe that at waves permanently invested all the continent and making dominant whatever the military, the warfare was, right? And this is to be observed quite limpidly, and it matched especially with the process of state building, right? The idea of traditionalism is something that comes from reaction to centralization. Why in Poland the Szlachta fought preferably with heavy cavalry in that sense? Well, it was obvious, because an army of conscripted peasants paid by the crown would have been used as a tool against the aristocracy, against them. And this is true for all the countries. So everything is explained along those political and social patterns. The military one followed that. Always. Always remember, this is the Clausewitzian Trinity. It works like that. And naturally, this dominance was exported, the Western model was exported around the world throughout colonialism at that point. Speaking of leadership, surely have in mind some greatest commanders, modern age, and we observed that, yes, maybe these are less famous than, the Napoleonic era ones. And this is obvious, because the least, let's say, the more restrained military capabilities are, the least the genius can emerge. Of course, we had Hannibals in the Middle Ages. It's simply that it was more difficult for them to rise, to show. Maybe they would rise, but to prove their own capacities, because they didn't have the military instruments to handle at the scale from which this most advanced statal entities could, right? So it's absolutely normal. Von Clausewitz explains it quite brilliantly. During the early modern age, armies were slower, less, more unwieldy, and therefore also what could what could be there in terms of enormous tactical sophistications of timing, maneuvering. Of course, during the 18th century, this would change, right? But we definitely can look at important reformers like the aforementioned Maurice of Nassau and Gustavus Adolphus, that were a bit comprehensive leaders. Especially Gustavus Adolphus is one of the most complete military geniuses in history. But he got interested in everything, right? We have also still great cavalry commanders like Prince Rupert, von Pappenheim, other great generals. We can make the enormous name Cromwell, right? Henry IV of Navarre, the Bourbon dynasty of France, but Condé, Montecuccoli, Turenne, Spinola, Farnese, as we were saying, Gonzalo de Cordoba. Well, you look at him, people barely know sometimes who he was, right? That gives you the scale of properly the of the misunderstanding we have of such times. All people more or less know, yes, guns, that's the thing of the modern age. What about all the effort that was behind, that made that work? Right? I mean, sometimes it's like if you haven't, we dedicated, for example, that series to Prince Eugene. That surely is more of an early 18th century commander, like Marlborough, right? They are different men. They from these ones that we're commenting now. It surely stemmed from this background that was all about making a scientific effort to improve the power here. I mean, if you don't study the Rhine campaigns of Montecuccoli and Turenne, what did you study about the second half of the 17th century, military-wise? Those are important chapters you have to know if you want to orientate yourself in these wars, because otherwise it's like, teaching maths without know how to make subtractions and additions. It doesn't work quite well. So on Schwerpunkt, we'll try to cover satisfactorily all these topics in a way that can reconnect a bit everything, because that's our comprehensive interest. We wouldn't do otherwise. If you wonder why we make these videos in the first place, that's the point. We want to have give a broader understanding of these phenomena without being even expert. Myself, I'm not, about the period, but surely maybe even disclosing about certain realities, certain armies, certain peoples that are definitely worth mentioning at least. Anyhow, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.